Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 29th ever Highlight Haven interview. My name is Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by Shane Mettlen from Daily News Record Sports. Shane, it's great to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get right into it. I just want to start by talking about Matthew Sluka, who obviously JMU acquired in the transfer portal recently. Sluka spent his first four collegiate seasons at Holy Cross, where he built up a connection with Bob Chesney. Sluka then transferred to UNLV, but ended up leaving due to an NIL dispute worth over $100,000. During his three starts with the Rebels in 2024, he completed just under 44% of his passes, throwing for 318 yards, six touchdowns, and an interception. He also added 253 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Do you expect Sluka to immediately take over as the starter in 2025?
I mean, that's a big question
Mhm.
because, for one, Jamie brings back their starter, Alonzo Barnett, but he was injured
Mhm.
on the last play of the regular season. Um, don't know the exact diagnosis, but it seems like it's a fairly significant injury. I'd be shocked if he's available for spring ball. Whether or not he's available to go, ready to go at the start of the season, is really up in the air. I wouldn't be surprised if he misses some time in the fall. So there's that. They also, same day that Sluka committed, Camden
Yeah.
Coleman, who was a starter at Richmond, also committed to JMU. So I think it's going to be a competition for the starting job. But Sluka is obviously one of three guys who has the experience and the stats and everything else to kind of
Yeah.
be in the mix for that. So we'll see what ends up happening at quarterback for JMU. But I don't think it's a guarantee he's a starter, but I think he's definitely going to be in the mix.
Yeah, now speaking of Camden Coleman, I also want to talk about him a little bit. Obviously, he played for Richmond, as you mentioned, and Barnett suffered a right leg injury on the final offensive play against Marshall on October 30th. Non contact injury, which can be a lot more serious, kept him from playing in the Boca Raton Bowl, obviously. What do these two signings tell you potentially about Barnett's health? Does that say that he's, not on track to start the season? Is this kind of a bad sign for his health if we sign these two guys?
I it's hard to say. I
Mhm.
mean, they needed to replace a couple quarterbacks on the roster anyway. They had open
Yeah.
spots for quarterbacks. The fact that they got two guys who you would think would want to go somewhere where they can play and get meaningful snaps does make you wonder. What his status is. I'm hoping that at some point in the relatively near future we hear a little bit more. Or they make some sort of announcement exactly what happened. But it does seem like the injury was pretty significant,
Mhm.
um, and so maybe more question marks than knowing for sure whether he's going to be out. But I don't think you want to go into the season necessarily with no options. But the thing that does make me wonder is, those two players in particular choosing to go to JMU. It doesn't surprise me that JMU would go after those guys, regardless of whether or not Barnett can play. But them choosing JMU does kind of make you wonder if they expect to have a good
Mhm.
opportunity to try to start.
Yeah, now speaking of Richmond and obviously Camden Coleman, JMU recently added two wide receivers from Richmond, Landon Ellis and Nick DeGennaro through the transfer portal. Both Ellis and DeGennaro were teammates at Richmond last season, where they combined for 1,164 receiving yards and eight receiving touchdowns. I'd say DeGennaro's um probably the most productive guy that JMU added in the transfer portal this year, at least on offense. With JMU having just lost many valuable wideouts, what are your expectations for these two guys this upcoming season?
I think they'll both be on the field a lot. You know, hard to say, who's going to start, who's not, but they're going to play a lot of snaps.
Yeah.
So they needed to fill out those positions. A guy like Cam Ross ends up
Yeah.
transferring out, who, I'm not sure. It's hard to say if this is upgrade or downgrade bringing those guys in. He was pretty productive. He was absolutely really good kick returner too. But I think you got to feel pretty good about bringing those two guys in to fill the gaps that you have from guys either graduating or moving on in the transfer portal. So, you know, the fact that they're coming with their quarterback too, it all kind of adds to, trying to predict what's going to happen. You don't know, but I mean, that's definitely, I would think a factor in everything is you bring in three big keys to Richmond's offense, and Richmond had a really good season. It does make things pretty interesting when you look at the offensive additions.
And then obviously, Dollison graduating, that's going to be another major loss for the Dukes. But I want to talk about Cam Ross, who you just mentioned. Cam Ross was very productive last season. He was the fourth leading receiver for the Dukes, and he led the team in drops, though, and he had 100 less yards than he did with UConn in 2023. While it wasn't a bad year for him, he didn't do quite as much as I think some people thought he would. I think say expecting him to do better than he did in UConn the previous year wouldn't have been that high of expectations. I wouldn't say he necessarily did that. Is this departure or how will this departure affect JMU? And was Cam Ross kind of a disappointment in any way last season?
I think what you mentioned with the drops was probably the one thing that was disappointment. I
Yeah.
wouldn't get too hung up on the total
Yeah.
yardage and things like that. Jamie really spread the ball. That was one thing Barnett really did. Like he had 7 or 8 different pass catchers most games. Like they spread the ball around, which they had some depth at wide receiver. They got it to the guys out of the backfield to use their tight ends. So the fact that maybe he didn't have as many catches or many yards, I don't know if that necessarily makes it a disappointment, but the drops were a little bit of a concern,
Mhm.
for him and a few other guys on the team. But like he wasn't maybe as sure-handed as Ymir Knight, a guy they'll bring back who played a lot in the slot, was really kind of their possession receiver type of guy. Um, you know, Giancarlo in particular, these guys from Richmond, they did not have many drops, and if they can kind of improve in that area, Barnett's numbers would have looked a lot better. Last year they were good to begin with, but his completion percentage, I think, was hurt by some of those drops. And whoever ends up being the starter, you're gonna want to have guys who catch it when you throw it to them. If you get it near them, and they may be improved in that regard this year.
Yeah, now sticking with the offensive side of the ball, offensive lineman Zach Greenberg was also a recent move that JMU made, adding him from UNC. Greenberg also transferred through the portal, obviously, just about 3 weeks ago. Greenberg spent time playing left tackle, guard, and center with the Tar Heels. However, in an interview with JMU Sports News, he stated that he preferred to play center because that's what he played when he was growing up. Of course, he's a very versatile guy. Where do you expect JMU to put him this season?
That's a good question. If he likes to play center, they may be able to do that. I mean, they obviously bring back guys, in a lot of spots on the offensive line, but people have moved around. Especially under the previous staff, under Kurt Signetti,
Yeah.
guys moved across the offensive line a lot. It was a little more stable, I guess, in terms of like positions people played last year. So, I mean, some of these are questions that like may have better answers for you after we see some stuff in spring ball. But I think he probably could get in there and mix in the mix for the center spot because he could still mix some guys like Tanner Morris or somebody over. They can play multiple positions, so it may depend on even who's the
Yeah.
quarterback, who's more comfortable with the guys that they're taking snaps from. So a lot of question marks, but the good ones that you want to see to have some options when you head into spring.
Yeah, now JMU's defense was obviously well above average last season, and they were in 2023 as well. Despite the coaching change, they still were one of the best defenses, if not the best defense in the Sun Belt Conference last year. However, one of the positions that I thought they could have used a little more help at was linebacker. They didn't have the most depth at linebacker. Obviously, Jacob Dobbs had 74 tackles, 3 sacks, and 3 fumble recoveries. But the rest of the linebacker group was somewhat underwhelming, if you ask me. Are you worried about the linebacker depth now that Dobbs is declaring for the NFL draft?
Um, yeah, I mean, it seems like that's an area they're definitely targeting in the portal. I mean, wouldn't be surprised if we see more guys that can play linebacker coming through the portal. They do play, basically a 2 linebacker system, which I think helps. Like they're just not going to have as many of those guys on the roster. But there was a noticeable drop off when Dobbs was hurt for a good chunk
Yeah.
of the second half of the season. You talk about 74 tackles. He did that in what, like 8 games, I think,
Yeah.
basically. So, yeah, you miss big production leadership from him too. But, um, you know, I think is there's play that's an area where they probably still need to do some work here in the portal, whether it's guys who are still there or what happens after spring. But um, I don't know if I'd label it a concern quite yet, but it's
Yeah.
definitely an area where I think they're still working on it.
Yeah, now another defensive player that kind of interests me is Aiden Gobera. He was another transfer that JMU recently acquired. He was from Notre Dame, and Gobera suffered a knee injury during fall camp in 2023. This injury kept him from playing throughout the 2024 season as well. While Gobera is unproven at the college level, he does have a lot of hype coming out of high school, according to 27 or 24/7 Sports. He was the 180th player nationally and the seventh player from the state of Virginia. Do you expect Gobera to, have a lot of playing time with JMU this season?
I would think if he's healthy,
Mhm,
yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting one because
mhm.
everything you just said, really
Yeah.
highly recruited out of high school, like the kind of guy, JMU, a group of five program, probably doesn't have much of an opportunity to recruit
Mhm,
out of high school, but has had so many injury problems, has really not played college football. I think at one point he was like basically saying he was retiring from football because of injuries, and I guess um, at some point decided he wanted to play again, and went to the portal. Um, and frankly, things that are changing in the NCAA, I think there's still the assumption that the House settlement will probably go through, which will lead to um, changes in roster numbers for teams. And it might be a situation where he's coming from Notre Dame. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Power Five, Power Four type programs that we just maybe don't have room for a roster spot for a
mhm.
guy we don't know if he's going to be healthy enough to play. Whereas JMU is willing to take a risk on somebody
Yeah.
who
Mhm.
like could potentially be really, really good. So that's one that's like really, really interesting to watch, see how much he participates in spring football and how healthy he looks. And because I would think if he is a guy who can play a lot of snaps for you, potentially a difference maker just on the talent that we know he has. But we just really haven't been able to see him play
Yeah.
healthy football at the college level.
We've talked about 12 minutes about the transfer portal already, but we can't ignore the recruiting class as well. JMU also made some big moves on early signing day, bringing in 15 different incoming freshmen. Out of those 15 guys, if you had to make a prediction, I know this is really tough because obviously freshmen might not get the most play this upcoming season. Who do you think is going to make the biggest impact out of those players?
Oh, that can be tough.
Mhm.
I'll mention a guy who I just saw, like, just posting that he arrived on campus already. Kai Colin
Yeah.
um, is somebody who I think, may be ready to play. He's kind of got that coach's kid like background who makes him, I think, really smart. Plus, they've had, good success with being able to get some of these high school seniors graduated early and in for a second semester for spring football, like before their freshman year, which makes a huge difference as far as being ready to maybe contribute as a true freshman is if you're there for the spring. So he's one of those guys who's on campus and was just fresh in my mind. So I may have had a different answer for you yesterday or today, but like that's one I think has a chance to um, maybe get in there and see some snaps on defense.
And transitioning over to some JMU basketball, obviously they're in the middle of the season right now. On Saturday, JMU men's basketball lost to Appalachian State 58-50, marking their ninth loss of the season. Bryce Lindsey led the Dukes with 13 points, shooting 4 of 8 from the field. What stood out to you about JMU's performance in this game?
In that game in particular, it was that the offense just never was
Yeah.
able to get
Mhm.
going. A 50-point performance is you're not going to get it done very often, and
Mhm.
they actually played fairly well defensively. You know, App State's shooting percentages by the end of the
Mhm.
game were okay, especially from three. I think they shot 50% from three, which hurts, but they had stretches. They had a 5-minute drought in the first half. They had a like almost 4-minute drought in the second half. They had lots of stretches in the game where they just were not putting the ball in the basket, and Jimmy wasn't able to do much with that. They had an 8-0 run to end the first half, but that was over
Mhm.
several minutes.
Yeah.
A long enough time that could have easily been more like a 15-16-0 run and maybe had a nice lead going into halftime. But Jamie just wasn't really ever able to take advantage of App State's own struggles.
Mhm.
And you know, Miles Tate's really good player in the Sun Belt. Does a little bit of everything for App State, and they just have a little more continuity right now at this point in their program than JMU with all turnover. So yeah, in that particular game, it was offense. There's been other days where it's been defense for JMU, but they just really couldn't get it going Saturday.
Yeah, this was their second lowest scoring performance of the season. I believe they scored 49 against South Alabama earlier in the year. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Xavier Brown. At the start of the season, I was convinced that Xavier Brown was the number one scorer on this team, and he would continue to be the number one scorer. In his first 7 games, he averaged just over 15 points per game. However, in his last 11 games, he's averaged under 9 points per game, including a 3 point performance on Saturday. In Brown's 2 games against App State this season, he shot a combined 1 of 14 from the field, including 1 of 11 from beyond the arc. Are Xavier Brown's recent struggles something to worry about?
Probably not. He's not necessarily the most consistent shooter
Mhm. Yeah.
for his career. He'll do some other things. He's a really good defender, and quite frankly, he's never played well against App State in his career. Like, I mean, they've won 4 straight now against JMU. Even going back to last year when JMU didn't lose very many games, they lost twice to App State, and that's just been a tough matchup for him. I would expect him to get it together. And it's also kind of the case where, they play 3 guys who can really kind of play the same spot, like combo point guard, off guard type guys, and it's Xavier, Mark Freeman,
Mhm.
and you mentioned Bryce Lindsey. All
Yeah.
3 of those guys get similar minutes, similar number of shots, similar everything. And, it seems like it's kind of like one guy's night most of the time. And Bryce had a better night on Saturday. That's when they've been really effective, though, is if you get 2 or 3 of those guys hitting shots on the same day, they're really tough to beat. But I wouldn't get too worried about it. Xavier, just individually at this point, I think he's going to have up and down games, and but they're going to ask different things of him different times. But I would expect to see his scoring kind of track back up. Especially as frankly, their schedule looks to get a little bit easier here. They played some of the best teams in the Sun Belt
Yeah.
already. And that's when probably things will start to get a little more concerning if they don't string together some wins here in the next couple of weeks, because the schedule should be easier than playing South Alabama and App State twice and some of the teams that they've had trouble with.
Yeah, now Bryce Lindsey obviously led the Dukes in this game. He's a redshirt freshman. While Lindsey has been very impressive this season, exactly 70% of his attempted shots have come from beyond the arc. Lindsey has also made the 6th most three-pointers of anyone in the Sun Belt Conference. And don't get me wrong, I am a really big fan of Bryce Lindsey. And while his 3-point game is extremely impressive, do you think that he'll be able to expand his game in the future, really work inside the 3-point line as well?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean he's early in his career. I mean, and he does a little bit. He can get to the basket, but such a good 3-point shooter. I mean, they run a lot of sets just to get him those 3-point shots because they do have Mark Freeman, who I mentioned, who is almost the opposite. He wants to go to the basket. Little guy, but he's got a good package of moves that down around the rim. Draws a lot of fouls, so he's almost the opposite. He goes to the basket a lot. He'll shoot a few threes, but for the most part, when Bryce comes onto the floor, they're running something to try to get him a 3. It's not so much that he can't necessarily go to the basket, but they
Yeah.
do try to kind of like play to his strengths.
Yeah, now speaking of Mark Freeman, he has led the Dukes in points this season, points per game, averaging slightly under 13 points per game. I believe it's 12.4 after Saturday's game. Despite being just 5'11, as you mentioned, Freeman is without a doubt one of the most effective scorers on JMU's entire roster. What has impressed you the most about him this
Yeah,
season?
probably his toughness going to the basket,
Yeah.
because I mean, listed at 5'11", I don't think he's that tall. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm taller than him, and I would probably be listed at 5'10". So, you know, he's not a very big guy, but he draws fouls, he finishes through contact, and can get under the rim, do some things to
Yeah.
kind of use the basket to his advantage. to get around defenders. Um, so he's been impressive that way. He hits some threes, but he's not necessarily like a great 3-point shooter. But he gets to the free throw line, and he's also, I think, really probably the last 10 games or so has felt a little bit more comfortable, maybe like just taking the ball in his hands and trying to make something happen when things aren't working offensively. Um, I think early on the season, coming in as a new guy in this program, maybe almost unselfish to a fault, like,
Yeah.
afraid to take too many shots, things like that. But he's had a couple 30-point games since then where he's really taken things, um, taking the whole team under his own wing when he's feeling it. And I think that's what we'll see a little bit more from him. He's not going to score 30 every night. He'll score 30 one night and 7 the next. But um, we're going to see more big games from him, I think.
Yeah, now Freeman is currently a senior on his fourth college team. How would you say his leadership has impacted JMU this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been pretty big, and it's
Yeah.
it's tough because
Mhm.
I don't know. There wasn't necessarily a clear leader coming in. Xavier Brown was the guy who the lone starter coming back from last year, um, and then so he's had some leadership responsibilities. But Mark, he knew Preston Spradlin's system. He played for him at Morehead State. Like you said, he's been around the block a few times. Um, you know, Recently became a father. Has a family. He's kind of at a different stage in his life almost. Because he's mid-20s. He's been in
Yeah.
college for 6 years. He he kind of takes on all those things. I think he's probably matured a lot in the last year or two. That's helped him with that. But they do need a little bit more of like clear established roles, I think, as far as like who's the leader of this team and who's kind of setting the tone of things. That has been tough to come by with so many new players on the roster.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that Terrence Edwards did a really good job, obviously being that leader last season, and then he left. So I think Freeman has done a really good job stepping into that role, sort of. JMU's next matchup is obviously on Wednesday against the 8-11 Old Dominion Monarchs. The Dukes have a 76% chance to win, according to ESPN. However, JMU is just 1-7 this season on the road, and that does include their tournament games at a neutral location. But still, I should say 1-7 when they're not at home this season, which is obviously not an ideal statistic. What are the keys to victory for the Dukes in this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, they want to establish the pace. Cause some turnovers and get out in transition. That's when their offense is the best. Like they're not a great half court offensive team. Like even they do run some sets for Bryce Lindsey, like I said, and sometimes get some good looks that way. But trying to like kind of feed the post has been hit or miss with them. When they get out running and get ahead of the pack and get some transition buckets, that's their best situation. And if they can do that at ODU, the road record has, like you said, not been great. I think they did get 2 neutral court wins at their Thanksgiving tournament, but they haven't won in anybody else's arena this year. And that kind of goes back a little bit to, like I said, like who they've played. Their non-conference schedule was relatively tough. They lose to Norfolk State, Towson, some of those games on the road, but those teams are potentially going to win their conferences.
Mhm.
So they're decent teams, and they start off with some of the best teams in the Sun Belt on the road too. So they may be getting into a stretch of some more winnable road games. On paper, they should beat ODU and Georgia State on the road this week. But we haven't seen them play their best away from home. So that'll be a good question mark because it'll be a good atmosphere down in Norfolk. They'll have a great crowd there, but there'll be a good number of JMU fans there too. In state, a lot of their alumni
Yeah.
live in that area. So it's an opportunity, I think, to maybe turn the page on that road game situation if they can get one on Wednesday
Mhm.
um, against a team that on paper they probably are deeper and more talented than.
Mhm. Yeah, now I do have one final question to ask before we wrap things up. If there was one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring sports broadcaster and journalist like me, what would it be?
um, do what you're doing. Like, do your own thing. Like, great thing about this day and age is you can just learn on the job at your age, and you're doing a podcast, which is great. Anything else you can do, if you're interested in writing or doing other broadcast stuff, reach out to the local media outlets and say like, hey, I'm really interested. If there's anything I can do to help you guys out, um, let me know. And they may have you typing up box scores or you know working in production stuff, like just running tapes back and forth, whatever it happens to be. But reach out to people in your area that are in the business and just ask them if there's things that you can do. And because you can go to school for this and you can learn some things, but you don't learn anything as good as just actually doing it and finding out what works and what doesn't.
Mhm. Yeah, I really, really do appreciate that. Again, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up?
No, just yeah, appreciate you having me on, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, and where can the people watching find some of your work if they want to check out what you do?
DNRonline.com, /sports. That's our sports section for
Mhm.
the Daily News Record. My stuff's always there. Or if you want to follow me on uh, X, Twitter, whichever one you want to call it, it's at Shane_DNR Sports. Usually post links to most of the stuff that I write there, and podcasts and everything else. So those are two easiest places to find what I'm doing.
Again, big thanks to Shane Mettlen for being the 29th ever Highlight Haven interview guest. And as always, we will see you next time.